We'll do this together.
David Goliath.
Okay, so I'm here to make the position, of course, that if there is a pulmonary nodule that you need to biopsy, that you should be doing this via robotics. And of course, I'm taking on my good friend, Pallav, Shah, who already is going to lose, as you can tell from the picture, because who looks tougher? So, all right, I'm going to start with the predicate that our patients deserve the best outcomes. So as we talk about the ability to use bronchoscopes to get to the periphery, as you saw Dr. Ko just elegantly deliver, their yields in the 80s, and that's fantastic. He's one of the best peripheral bronchoscopists in the world. Right before that, you had Amir Abramovich, one of the other best peripheral bronchoscopists in the world. Is that skill set able to be replicated around the world? One of the great equalizers is the application of additional technology. So our patients ultimately deserve the best, because why were these technologies developed? Because if we go back in time, this is how bad we all have been at this. These are the yields historically with the first, so I would call this zero generation of bronchoscopy. Us just sort of looking at a CT scan, blindly pushing some instruments out. Basically, it was a coin toss. It's why traditionally bronchoscopy didn't play a major role in nodule diagnostics. We already heard earlier today as well a fantastic talk by Dr. Sasenia about how we're defining yield, also based on what's the cancer prevalence in your area, et cetera. So in the end, we need an answer, because we have a patient in front of us, and is it tuberculosis, or is it cancer, or is it something completely different? Well, why don't we just do a needle biopsy? Let's kick bronchoscopy out of it completely. I was at a fantastic conference with my good friend, Dr. Shah, and at that conference, the chest radiology folks were busy talking about how great they are and how they don't need robots. And in fact, what they were talking about was how expensive bronchoscopy is compared to a needle biopsy. And look, they've got a decent sensitivity. Granted, there's a lot of publication biases here. They've got a not so great specificity, and they've got a pretty abysmal false negative rate. They also forget to mention their profoundly high pneumothorax rate, and their tumoral bleed rate, and their hemoptysis rate. And then what do you do when your patient's already had a lobectomy? Does anyone want to needle the only lung this guy has? I don't think so. So again, do we need to make a diagnosis? We can try to do it with a scope, but there's a cost to that first failed bronchoscopy. There's a cost to that diagnostic yield that's still in the mid-70s. There's the money and time that's ultimately required for a second procedure. When everyone talks about how expensive robotics are, and there's no debate, they are expensive, but there's also the cost of the missed diagnosis and the additional procedures. There's the cost that the delay until they get to that next procedure, the cancer's now spread. So the opportunity to have cured that patient goes down. Or that it was tuberculosis and now they've infected their entire family or their entire workplace. The public health issues that come with the delay in the appropriate diagnosis. And of course, you've got a patient who you said, I think you have cancer. We should do a bronchoscopy. And then you have to walk out and say, I failed. And now hang out for a while until I can get around to getting another procedure set up, one that has a higher complication rate, et cetera. So now I'm going to talk about robots. And I'm clearly very biased. But of course, that's the purpose of this debate. So I'm going to focus just specifically on these outcomes. This was Mike presented some of this stuff earlier. What I'm going to show you is when people have been talking about advanced imaging, right up front, when you look at one of the first generation of robotics, the Ion, the yield when you add advanced imaging approaches the low 90s. It's pretty incredible. When you take a look at Taj's study, the Frontier study, the first study that came out from the second generation of robotics, you see a yield based on which definition you want to use, up to about 95%. I think the key thing that's often lost in this study, the Frontier study, was that this was the Australian group's first exposure to robotics. So when people ask about a learning curve, this is how well they do, having never used a robot before, though obviously being very accomplished endoscopists. When you look at the experience from the Cleveland Clinic, tool and lesion rate of 98%, strict definition of 90% diagnostic yield. Same with the data from Federbush out at Long Island Jewish. Look at their diagnostic yield ranging from 88 to 93. And then if you look at our own experience of a 95% yield, and notice what we're biopsying, majority of our lesions are less than 20 millimeters, a third are less than 10 millimeters, majority have no bronchus sign, majority are on the peripheral of the lung, some even on the visceral pleura of the lung. So the ability to get to places we've never been able to get to before with reliable, terrific accuracy. And then I'll just give you some case examples, because I'd be curious to know how we would all go to approach this one. Because here's the CT, and look where that's located. That's an extremely challenging location. But when you can see it with the built-in tomosynthesis, in this particular case, a Galaxy robot, you can target that lesion and then make sure, no matter where you are in the lung, that you can, even if you had to tunnel, if there was no airway, put in your forceps or your needle or your cryoprobe right into it. And of course, this was a carcinoid. Or what about GGOs? It's a minus 582 Hounsfield unit GGO. There's the reference CT, there's the tomo image, and then what you're going to see here, because the airways went around it, we're tunneling with the needle, making a nice hole in the airway. The hole, the aspiration was diagnostic. The hole we left behind, we were able to pass our forceps through, and I'll show you it here, and then I'll go back to that image. There's the airway we made. The ability to have that stability of the robot, optics that are always on, that you get with the second generation of robotics, to then pass any instrument you need to go through that. And what we were able to show is right up front, this was an adenocarcinoma. Not surprisingly, that's, by the way, just an image from the Van Gogh system that allows you to basically intraoperatively measure metabolic activity of the tissue you removed. So it's almost like a miniaturized PET scan. So that's what all the glowing yellow cells are. So I wanted to be short and brief because I want to allow time for my colleague to give his really horrible failed argument. But I think in the end, all kidding aside, what we're always up against, of course, is that at any institution, Joe's always made a great statement, which is the best system is the one you have, right? You can dream of having any system out there and any imaging system, but in the end, it's always dependent on cost, access, and availability. And we're all incentivized differently. Robots pay more in the United States than a standard bronchoscopy. So there's not even a rationale to use a standard bronchoscope for a nodule in the periphery because you get actually better remuneration if you use a robotic scope. And then, of course, in the end, because people can have choice of where they want to go for their health care, robots bring in more patients. Right or wrong, there's the appeal of robotics. So I will end with that, and again, welcome anyone if they're in the Chicago area, and there's my contact information. And now, feel free to go get some lunch or go to the bathroom, etc., because the next talk is a colossal waste of your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kyle, for that very, very formidable argument. May I now ask Dr. Pallav Shah to provide his end of the argument. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you to my esteemed colleague who really didn't listen to the talk question. It was robots for all nodules. Well, my view is that there's a very important role for robots, but not for all nodules. Why? Because robots are virtual, aren't they? They're not real. So let's go from there. But before I say that, I've got a message for my Indian friends.
नमस्ते मेरे हैदराबाद के दोस्तों, शुभ संध्या। मैं पल्लव शाह हूँ और मैं जो कहना चाहता हूँ वह ये है कि मेरे दोस्त काइल होगार्थ से मत सुनिए जो शिकागो से हैं। वह चाहता है कि आप महंगे उपकरण खरीदें और आप जानते हैं रोबोट्स और विभिन्न प्रौद्योगिकियों पर लाखों पाउंड और डॉलर खर्च करें और मेरे पीछे की तरह एक अंतरिक्ष यान बनाएं। लेकिन मैं आपको अपनी व्याख्यान में दिखाऊंगा कि हम इसे कैसे सरलता और सस्ते में कर सकते हैं और भारतीय तरीका। धन्यवाद। नमस्ते मेरे हैदराबाद
Basically, to translate for you, Kyle, I said, don't listen to that big American guy. He's too expensive. I'll show you a cheaper Indian way. So basically, just like we said, we've got all this technology out there. And, you know, we've seen some superb bronchoscopies tell us that they can do a 4-millimeter nodule using a piece of straw. But the real answer is, can everyone do it? So how do we standardize it and still get results that are just as good? So what I really wanted to do is take this opportunity to remind everyone that there are established techniques there. It's just you have to use them wisely. Transthoracic ultrasound, that's real-time imaging. And if the lesion is right against the chest wall, you basically just wave an ultrasound wand and under direct vision, take a biopsy. You've got linear EBUS. Don't forget, linear EBUS can get much further than you actually realize it can get to. And we've seen the amazing work that our colleagues do with slim scopes. And then obviously you've got surgery. Those are all real-time imaging. We all talked about cone beam CT scanning, but that's near-time imaging. And now we shall put the robot where it needs to be. It is virtual. We're living in the imaginary world, and the robot relies on real-time imaging and near-time imaging to make it better. So let's just break that out a little bit more. So here's a case, large lesion, central chest. Do you need a robot? No. You just need an ultrasound and you can easily get that lesion. Here's another one. Do we need a robot? Well, in Chicago you need a robot. In London, you just get a CT-guided biopsy of that lesion. So basically this is where the difference lies. And here you have a needle going straight into that lesion and a biopsy done. But you have to choose the target case wisely. And this is a case again, robot or no robot? Well, actually, this is a case for my friend Stefano Gasparini, because he will get the EBUS scope out. And you don't really need cone beam imaging for this, but I just used it for illustration purposes. And you can see with this lesion, which wasn't directly adjacent to the airway, you can push your EBUS scope towards the lesion and get real-time imaging. No robot in sight. Okay, this is a slightly more challenging one, I'd say. Here is a patient with a PET-avid lesion, which you can barely see on the CT scan. So there's the PET avidity, but it's virtually impossible to see on the CT scan apart from this very subtle area of thickening. And in fact, this patient was referred to me for a robot case, but what am I going to biopsy? I couldn't even see it on the robot, so I actually opted for linear EBUS, real-time imaging. And we basically saw a thin sliver of tissue and biopsied it, and it came back as a metastasis from a prostate cancer. So yes, use a robot, but not for all nodules, only selected nodules. I think my distinguished colleagues have already illustrated this beautifully, but even an amateur bronchoscopist like me can see that this is straight into the lesion, and even I, with no peripheral bronchoscopy skills, can simply target this lesion and get a successful answer. So here, I'm just using some cases to illustrate that if you choose your subject wisely, you're going to bring your diagnostic yield to the 90% for whichever technique you use. So you want a toolbox. You can't just have one tool. If you just have a Phillips screwdriver in your toolbox, you cannot do everything you need. So you need a toolbox, and therefore you need more than a single robot. This is cone beam CT scanning, and like we saw earlier, you can use the mapping, tracing, and slim scopes in a variety of ways, but I'm not going to labor the point because my previous colleagues have demonstrated this elegantly. But where I will say the robot becomes invaluable is where you've got tricky lesions. Here, you're very close to the arch of the aorta, there's a bulla up there, so in that situation, I will bring out the robot. So for selected nodules, the robot has a very, very important role to play. And here you can see that with the combination of cone beam CT and robotics, you can very accurately get a lesion that's there. And in fact, what this will show you that actually even with a robot, I'm a little bit anterior to the lesion, and with cone beam CT, it elevates the practice because then you can make some fine precision movements where you move a little bit posterior, and then you will get in a much better location, and you then use a combination of real-time imaging, radial EBUS, confirm you're in the right spot, and then our favored cryobiopsy to get a diagnostic answer. Then there'll be lesions. Amir will probably go and target this with his scope, but I'm a bit more chicken, so we used obviously a little bit better control. So we used the robot here, navigate to right next to the heart, confirm on real-time imaging that we're in the right spot, and then we use our near-time imaging to prove that we're in the right spot, and then we can take our biopsies. So basically what we're saying is use our multitude of technologies. I will concede that with ground glass lesions, I personally will opt for the robot because you can't really see it easily on radial ultrasound nor on fluoroscopy. And the advantage there is the cryobiopsies. And again, I'll stop short here because we've already talked about cryobiopsies, but just to highlight that for a ground glass lesion, my radiology colleagues are not as good as us because they get thin slivers of tissue, whereas we get huge, well-preserved architectural pieces of tissue. So where do we use the robot? We'll use it for bilateral nodules, multiple nodules. So this is one patient who had 3 different nodules. And in the old days, we would make the mistake of saying that they've got either metastatic disease. But actually what we found was this first lesion was an adenocarcinoma, mixed pattern. The second lesion was an adenocarcinoma purely lipidic. And the third lesion was a granuloma. So you don't write off patients without diagnosing every single nodule. So if they've got multiple nodules, take the robot out. So putting all of this into words, you can see that the efficacy of the different imaging techniques is variable if you look at the literature. So what you want to do by using the right circumstance is to push the shifts towards the better diagnostic yield and equilibrate with risk. So obviously linear EBUS, limb scope have very low risk, but if you use a lesion that's appropriate like I showed you, then the yield will be in the 90% with minimal risk. Under certain circumstances, electromagnetic navigation, cone beam CT might be more appropriate, intermediate risk, intermediate cost, and higher risk. And then finally, you've got the robots and CT-guided biopsy with great success, different costs and different risks. And you have to mentally balance all of this to make the right choice. Now, I had English translation, but I was going to skip that for you and basically say, thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll bring Carl back up so we can argue a bit more. Thank you. Now, this is where, with any good pro-con debate, we have to vote with our feet. So if you all think you should use a robot for every nodule, stand up.
You're standing.
And who thinks you should use a nodule selectively, a robot selectively? Stand up.
So one thing that was not brought up during your part of the talk was the lesion that you said you couldn't have seen with the robot because the robot you use requires you to remove your optics. So unlike a slim scope, you get to the periphery and you're now officially blind and you have to reuse $1 million cone beam system to make your $600,000 robot work better. Whereas my robotic system doesn't require all that additional technology. So there's one other weakness. The second weakness is how long does it take to get to the periphery? With you and I, when we use a robot, under a minute. You're there and you're ready to biopsy, like that. You were telling me earlier how long a bronchial branch tracing scope went. The number of cases I can get done per day is very important to me as well in my system, and you as well. So the argument against manipulating through a ton of airways is how long does it take? Again, not Amir and not Co, but the more average user.
Me.
And me. I mean, you don't want to watch me doing a thin scope to the periphery. I'll be there all day.
But the point is, David won. Goliath lost.